So in the reading corner today, it's my pleasure to welcome Finbar Hawkins, who is creative director for Aardman Animations and a writer. His debut children's novel or young adult novel, titled Simply Witch, will be published in October 2020. The story is set during the English Civil War, when Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, was terrorising the country, seeking out witches for trial, torture and murder. Welcome, Finbar.
Hello.
What an emotional read, which was both thrilling and full of jeopardy, but deeply moving as well. And I'm drawn to ask you why you connected with this particular period in history.
What drew me to it was originally the Pendle witch trials. In fact, my mum had always kind of talked to me about, how impactful that moment in history was, and it would be something interesting one day to write about. And when I was involved in my MA at Bath Spa, the brief was really, write something with an historical setting. And my mum's kind of refrain about looking at that area kind of came back to me. And we live in Wiltshire, a beautiful part of the world, and I kind of knew that I wanted to kind of set something around then. And as I was thinking about it, thinking, well, if you were a teenager and you'd grown up in an environment where all you knew was the witching way, was the family and the kind of the caste you'd grown up with, and suddenly something would come along and completely destroy that way of thinking, that setup, what that would mean, how would you deal with it? And it ran from there. And in the sense that witchfinders existed, there was a particular hysterical time during 1640s where persecution of the witch caste came back. And it led from that, really. It led from a voice and wanting to put myself into the shoes of a young girl who, had this magical kind of witching way upbringing, but also was a young girl, was a teenager having to deal with life and everything that it threw at her.
Let's talk about your young witch. She's called Evelyn or Evelyn, Evey, and she lives with her mother and sister. Her sister's called Dill, and Evey doesn't want to be a witch, does she? She reacts against this way of life.
Yes. Tell
us a bit about Evey.
Evey, yes. So she's 15, and she's kind of quite a possessive, slightly jealous personality. Certainly jealous of her younger sister, who she perceives in Evey's eyes. Her younger sister Dill, who's about 9, has always, kind of had it easy. Has always been, her mother's favourite. And Evey thinks, well, I'm not constantly going for chores and being told what to do, and she's a teenager. She's pushing at life. She wants a difference. She's grown up in that situation, but she also wants to find her own way. It isn't necessarily a witching way. So it's very important for me that was the case. That this is all of these feelings that come flooding at you when you're that age group have to be recognised as things that you're having to deal with from day to day, and especially when you're a sibling, because you're bouncing off them all the time. That was my sense of Evey, that she's full of this kind of frustration, but she was also very driven, but also has very kind of, a slightly possessive, jealous nature. And was about how she deals with that in herself, how she grows up, really.
Because it has to be said, although this is a historical story, it's very character driven, more so than plot driven. And it is about Evey coming to find herself, as perhaps we'll discover a little bit later as we move on into the story. But let's start at the beginning, because the beginning is really quite shocking.
The inciting incident, certainly.
Yes.
Well, Evey is the family is set upon by a pack of witch hunters, and her mother tells her to get for her and Dill to go. She tells Evey to look to Dill, to look after her. Also gives Dill an item which is a kind of precious to both of them, which is her scrying stone, which Evey's kind of cross about, but she hasn't got time to think. She's got to get away, and they run to the woods And as Dill is fighting to get back because they're hurting their mother, she's killed. She's killed by this pack. And the two girls are distraught, but have to run for their lives. And that's the beginning of the story. But it's also, in that beginning, Evey is full of rage and full of desire for revenge. And she's promised her mother that she'll look to Dill, look after her younger sister. But there's also, she's completely consumed by revenge. And that drives the story.
Yeah. So a scrying stone, is that like a hagstone, or are they different things?
Yes, I think I didn't want to be too kind of explicit about it in one sense, because it's about an object which meant something to them, and I want readers to be able to attach their own thoughts and stories to it. So I wrote a lot of backstory behind it, things that didn't really eventually make it into the final book, but about that and how the stone is handed on through families and how it can be used, and the importance of it and all that kind of stuff. But they eventually wanted it to really be inferred by the reader and to find their own way. But it's an important item that is used within spells.
I have to ask you, have you got one on your desk?
I do, of course I do. It's a black one I found that sits in your palm of your hand very neatly. There's something about that the kind of the fact that you turn something like that all the time and you're kind of picking it up and moving it around it, and it became important. Really, the stone is about connection to nature, and that was a big part of this book, is that a witch lives in constant connection with the land and with nature and with animals, and that's part of their magic. That's part of their communion, and the stone is a really bridge point into the natural world.
Absolutely. So just back to the story for a moment, because after witnessing this terrorizing and terrible incident, Evey and Dill run to the coven which their mother has told them to do. The coven which is where their aunt lives. And I think you were going to read a part of the story for us,
yes,
which occurs at this point.
Yes, absolutely. I will read to you. The wind moaned as we made towards the ridge. My legs ached from the climb and from the running. Fear makes you faster. Dill ran on with Spring, showing her all there was to see under the great sky. 2 pups now waved my skirt. We had to make the coven by nightfall. It would be better then. Better for all. We climbed on and up, heads down, and made for a brace of trees tilted by the wind. Dill hopped that last to claim her perch and crowed to the land below. She stopped and shouted back to me, her words blown away. Not far, I told you! But Dill only shook her head and shouted again. Sighing, I climbed to her side where the wind came rushing. And then I saw what she saw. They were across the valley, galloping fast. I pulled Dill low. Flint stones moved at my fingers. I counted them out. Meekin from town, Cooper from across the valley, Tom, a wicked lad. One burly who broke mother's arm, one thin who pissed upon her, one younger who smashed her skull. They have a leader, a tall one. I marked his black hat, proud of his pack. It's them, ain't it, Evey? If that beast howls, we're got. She don't howl. Dill stroked the wind through Spring's fur. Do you? Evey is a silly sister to think so. Yes, she is. Do you think of nothing but that stupid pup? Dill only stared ahead. That made me crosser. These men killed mother. I knows it, Evey. If you're not whispering to a dog, it's that stupid stone. It's not stupid. It's mother's, and I promise. I grabbed her. Look at me, will you? Leave me be. Sudden, the birds cried through our quarrel, swooped out above the ridge. It was a hawk, lifting, searching. The riders looked up to this hunter as it dropped to the valley. Get lower, Dill. Pebbles slipped under our feet. We all watched that lord of the air as he frowned upon us. What is it, Evey? You know the birds. Goshawk. See, his pale crown. Ah, he's beautiful. That he was, as he furled the cloak of his speckled wings and flew as an arrow straight and silent to the land, where a rabbit broke and leapt this way and that, jumping. In a plunge of wings and beak and talons the hawk struck. If there was a last cry, it was lost on the wind. Like that rabbit, he lifted away up into the white sky. And as we watched from high and below, the hunter, the hunted, I felt a pull in my heart, a song for my tender prey. Mark me, tall one, think you are the hawk. Nay, you are the rabbit spied from far above. Run quick, tall one, run ahead and see. Think your beak is sharp, my love? Nay, tall one, not as sharp as me. And like the hawk, I watched him as he raised to rally his pack. They kicked on, one behind the other, like black ants across the earth. So I opened my fingers and I squashed them tight in my sight.
Just listening to you read there, I'm getting a bit of what I think is Wiltshire twang coming through. So I was interested to explore the diction and the way in which the book is written and how you found this voice for Evey. Was it inspired by the place that you live, or history, or a bit of both? How did you kind of come to settle into that style?
I think it was, I live in Bath. I work in Bristol, surrounded by that lovely accent. And it was very important for me because this is where I, walk and think and, where I raise my children, so where we settled. And it's very important to be surrounded by that and immerse myself in that for the purposes of the book, so that the reader can get as close to the things that I'm thinking and seeing and feeling, all the kind of senses that you want to play. So that it's just felt right, really, that it would be, the kind of Somerset feeling and accent, and I guess also I wanted it to be, yes, she speaks in a certain way, because I wanted her to be something that a reader would find they'd be closer to her, in that sense, that she has a certain way of speaking, and that by following her kind of the strangeness, that it would you're more drawn into her.
Some of the grammar is or her syntax, her sentence structure is unusual by modern standards.
Yes.
Did you have to impose rules on yourself to make sure that you were consistent in the way that you wrote that, or did you just rely on your intuition?
I think a bit of both. I mean, it's a stylistic choice, right, that you're going in that way, and it can be, in one sense, you think, well, you could get yourself into tight corners quite quickly with it. So I experimented, and I also listened to folk music, and listened to all those sorts of things, and read other poetry, but also I was very determined about everything that I've just said about wanting it to be infused through her perception of the world. So it was a balance, really, which is also about the act of writing, to make something immersive and close, so that you are in the character, on their shoulder, but also at the same time being clear. So not being too, arcane, being too over the top. And I also recognise, that it's the nature of the way that it's written, which is important to me in terms of the way that it brings you into that character, is a Marmite thing. I know that in a sense that it's not for everybody, but it for me was about character, and if it brought you closer to her, then all for the better, really, because it was about eventually you're going to be feeling what she feels.
Evie's full name, if you like, they call her Evelyn of the Birds, and birds feature very strongly, and I felt in more than just a natural way. I could feel the symbolism of the birds, and at different points in the story, I mean, we have a heron, the crow becomes very important, we've got the swifts at the end of the story there. Were you aware of bird symbolism as you were writing? Yes,
absolutely. I mean, I think that's the thing about birds, that we're endlessly fascinated by them. They have this prehistoric nature, and they're part of myth and legend. It's Odin's ravens, and the way that the magpie is portrayed through history, and the way that crows are important about, either messengers of harbingers of doom, depending on what you're reading, or for their wisdom and their cleverness. And it's so fascinating how we attach story to birds, but I think also we're fascinated by them. They fly. Humans, if you ask anybody what kind of their top 3 wishes, it's probably on that list is the ability to fly. And I think that we project into birds, that when we look at them, with thinking, God, how do they see the land? And that was part of it, really. And as I say, I wrote a lot of kind of backstory about the witching way, and it was part of importance that witches are, when they get to a certain age, they are named. And that certainly happens to Evey, and it hasn't happened to Dill yet. And there's a sequence in the book where that you find out how she's named the way that she is. And it's also about magic, I think, because it's about, we project on animals, I think, in the sense that, why do we love cats and dogs? We give them emotion that perhaps isn't necessarily there. But also there's a cleverness, there's a steeliness to animals. They have to survive.
Mm. You've talked about witches being given their names at a certain point in their journey, in their life, like a rites of passage, really. And I'm sitting here with a copy of Diana Perkis's The Witch in History on my desk.
Yes.
I wondered if you'd had to, it feels well researched without the research weighing heavily in the story. So did you read around the topic of witches in the 17th century?
Yes. If anything, kind of, unavoidably makes rather gruesome reading. You're suddenly confronted by the reality of what happened. I mean, the witch hunts burst through again in the 1640s as a result, as you mentioned about with Matthew Hopkins kind of in his pomp. But witch hunts have been going on, for centuries. And if anything, they were starting to kind of die away from something what my reading would be telling me. And the Civil War was this great kind of coming together of stress and strife and blame and persecution. And witches or strange women, people that just didn't seem right, were the first to blame. And certainly that combined with an opportunist like Matthew Hopkins, we don't really have a sense of what his real motivations were, but he was there, and suddenly over the course of a year, well over 100 people had lost their lives as a result of the witch trials.
I wanted to ask you about one point to do with this, and this is the idea in one of your trials that it's witches accusing witches, and witches being used supposedly to help the Civil War and being called on to do that. Is that part of your fiction, or did you find evidence of that in your research too?
No, it was really a play on some of the persecution that there's obviously that we know the story that James I, was very terrified of, he'd written books on witches, and it's part of the conflation of witches with popery. And I took that story in terms of the fact that witches were being used against the king, and thought, well, actually be quite nice to play on it. And what if it actually was the case, was true, and make my own particular twist on it. And also about the kind of hypocrisy of a certain type of, man that was using it to his own ends, really. And that's what was going on. And people being double-crossed and people using each other and trying to build in a bit of story that, this is a story then, but it's about these things still go on.
I wanted to ask what element of this was to do with class as well, because you have another character in your story who is the daughter of one of the landed gentry or nobility.
Yeah.
I think maybe we need a bit of an introduction to her first.
Sure. So Anne Whitaker is a character that Evey encounters when she's on the path to off to find town, to find the people that have murdered her mother. And as she's on this path, she encounters, in fact, one of the pack, and doesn't really know that he's him at the beginning of that. And there's a struggle, and Anne is somebody that she encounters that kind of gets caught up in this struggle and defends Evey, fights for her, which is gobsmacking to Evey, who initially thinks to kind of use the opportunity to race away, and then sees that the man is turning on this fine lady, who's very striking, and it goes from there. There's the kind of, they throw in their lot together, and again, without wanting to give too many spoilers away, but there were two things that are going on with Evey and Anne. That she's somebody that, because she's older and she's different, that Evey's completely kind of taken by her. She's never encountered anybody like this before, and a way of also to get Evey talking, to get her emotionally responding to somebody else. And there was also a bit of me playing fast and loose, kind of fantasy element to this too. I'm quite well aware that, you know, that noble women and somebody of Evey's class, they wouldn't necessarily readily mix. But I thought, well, so what? I actually like this coming together of two people from different sides of the tracks. You know, we kind of have that trope of Prince and the Pauper that we kind of remember as kids. And I always like that story, that kind of coming together of two people that you wouldn't necessarily meet. It's a complete kind of fantastical situation, but that they would share things and differences and also find commonalities. And there are, you know, they realise there are lots of commonalities there. And I just like that collision of it, really, that it enabled them to both bounce off each other and learn from each other and become friends, you know.
That friendship is one of the highlights for me of the book. There are many of them, but I love the kind of warmth between them, and
that's so good to hear.
Beautiful relationship, as indeed is her. Although it's more of a struggle with her sister, there's a real depth to that relationship too. Can I ask you, when you were writing this, was there anything that you put into your writing that was there just to please and delight yourself?
I think Faye is kind of the little girl, Faye, Peter's daughter, when they get to meet this family, and they're in hiding, really, in sanctuary. So it's Anne's cousin. And again, this kind of fascination from Evey. She's not seen anybody, not seen a house like this, not been in a home like this. And she gets close to a little girl, Faye, who's 4, something like that. Has all blonde curls and smiles and is talking 10 to the dozen and full of play. And, you know, she's very strongly based on my experiences of being a dad to my daughter. And the sense of responsibility and excitement, wanting to protect your daughter and tickle them and have fun with them, and the responsibility of it and the love. I think that was the thing. I wanted to get that into those scenes. And so I don't think I could have written those scenes without being a dad myself, really.
I would just like to say for listeners that those scenes have a lovely lightness to them, much needed in a story that has lots of darkness in there too. I was struck by some of the wonderful illustrations in the book. There's a beautiful horse, the birds are gorgeous, and I was looking for the name of the illustrator and couldn't find it.
Yeah, so I illustrated the books and the drawings in the book, and it was just something that came naturally. I've always drawn, and in my mind's eye, when we were first talking about the book with Zephyr, my publisher, and I was saying how I'd always had this thing about, you know, the kind of charcoal drawings, and I always loved sketching, you know, as a kid and growing up. And I think the charcoal drawings I wanted them to have both kind of movement and a sense of magic about them, kind of sort of trying to get as much, that kind of a strong intensity and strong feeling into them, almost really from how Evey might see these things. You know, that her whole perception of nature is so vigorous and so coloured by this sense of magic, that I wanted to get that in some way into the illustrations and get that kind of that strength, and that was the point of it. So it was a really good thing to do, and also to see, if I was imagining Evey looking at a horse as that particular moment when that horse towers over her, to give him a kind of a vibration about that drawing. And that was the point of it. Almost like these drawings were something that how Evey sees the world. It was another opportunity to get you closer to the character, really.
It's they're fabulous, and I have to say, from a reader's point of view, the other thing that they do is that they give you some reflective space before you move on to the next chapter. So in terms of pacing your reading, I think they also serve that function too.
That's very true. And it's a pause to sort of draw your thoughts in before you move on. And I think what's this thing about really wanting to make this book as beautiful as we could make it too, because that's the natural world. That's, you know, to try and reflect those things. You know, it is dark. I do recognise that. And because dark things happen in the world, but to give it that balance, to give it that sense of beauty and light, and that was really important to me. The book is not ultimately about darkness; it's about hope and love.
Yeah, as we can see through the nature that comes through, and you've used the word balance there, and I think I'm going to leave our conversation thinking about that word, because not only have you used it in relation to thinking about nature, but the book itself is about restoring some personal balance in your life as well, isn't it? It's a word that you use quite a lot in the writing.
Yes, and it's, whether it's, there's a wrong that's occurred, and very important for Evey as part of her kind of her witching way, that's what she seeks to do, to right a wrong. But it's also about her finding balance in herself, and to being at peace with herself and peace with her sister. So ultimately it is about all of those things. It's about how you grow up.
Finbar, it's just been such a pleasure talking to you about Witch. Thank you so much for giving us some insights into your writing today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you have enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or SoundCloud or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues.